I'm 68 years old, and I'm dying of heart disease that the doctors say came from 41 years of carrying a secret so heavy it literally crushed the organ that's supposed to sustain life through whatever challenges existence might create. Before this disease takes what little time I have left, I need someone to know about Gabriel. About the 23 years from 1982 to 2005, when he protected my children and me with a love so pure, it redefined everything I thought I understood about family, strength, and what it meant to choose compassion over violence, when the world had taught us that power always corrupts, and that safety was just an illusion maintained by those too naive to recognize that monsters often wore human faces. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and back then I was 26 years old, fleeing through Olympic Peninsula rainforest with my 4-year-old daughter Emma and 18-month-old son Michael, carrying nothing but a diaper bag and the absolute certainty that staying with Detective Robert Mitchell meant death for all of us, while leaving meant becoming hunted animals, pursued by someone whose police badge gave him access to every resource necessary for tracking down the wife and children he considered his property, according to marriage laws that treated domestic violence as private family matters, rather than criminal behavior requiring intervention. What I never expected was that our desperate flight into Washington's most remote wilderness would bring us under the protection of someone whose existence challenged every assumption I held about what kinds of beings might choose to defend innocent children from predators who used institutional authority to hunt families beyond the reach of conventional assistance. Gabriel, I named him for the archangel who protected the vulnerable, was 9 feet of muscle and compassion who became more father to Emma and Michael than the man whose DNA they carried, more husband to me than the badge-wearing monster I'd legally married, and more family than any blood relative had ever managed to be through shared genetics rather than chosen love. The discovery that would change our lives forever happened on November 15th, 1982, when Robert's systematic hunt had driven us 40 miles into Olympic National Forest using police helicopters, K-9 units, and volunteer search operations that were officially concerned with locating missing persons, but actually represented coordinated efforts to return escaped property to someone whose ownership rights were protected by marriage contracts and law enforcement networks that treated wives as assets, requiring recovery, rather than autonomous beings deserving protection from systematic torture. Emma was crying from hunger and exhaustion, while Michael's fever was climbing to levels that indicated serious illness, requiring medical attention we couldn't seek without exposing our location to Robert's surveillance network. I was beginning to understand that wilderness survival with 2 small children exceeded my capabilities, and that choosing death by exposure might be preferable to the prolonged torture that Robert had promised would follow our inevitable capture. That's when Gabriel emerged from rainforest shadows, like something from ancient mythology, but whose presence offered protection rather than the terror that folklore attributed to encounters with beings whose existence challenged official understanding of what kinds of consciousness might inhabit territories that humans considered exclusively their own domain. He was magnificently enormous, covered in thick brown fur that glistened with rainforest moisture, with eyes that held depths of intelligence and immediate understanding of our desperate situation. "Little ones are sick," Gabriel observed in English, that was careful but perfectly clear, his voice carrying gentle authority that made clear he comprehended both our immediate medical crisis and the broader circumstances that had forced our flight into wilderness areas where survival required assistance from sources that existed beyond human institutional support. Dangerous man hunts you with metal birds and tracking animals, but mountain protects those who need protection from beings who use strength to cause harm rather than provide safety. For 23 years, Gabriel became the father Emma and Michael deserved, the partner whose strength defended rather than exploited our family's vulnerability, and the protector whose presence transformed our terrorized flight from civilization into something approaching paradise, sustained by love that transcended every boundary except institutional forces that valued control over consciousness and strategic advantage over individual relationships that proved moral courage could exist in forms humanity had never been brave enough to acknowledge. But our sanctuary was destroyed when Emma's college application essays about her extraordinary childhood with a remarkable adoptive father attracted attention from federal agencies that had been monitoring university admissions for evidence of civilian contact with undocumented entities representing potential security threats or strategic research opportunities requiring immediate governmental intervention. The heart disease that's killing me started beating irregularly the day federal agents surrounded our Olympic Peninsula homestead and loaded Gabriel into transport vehicles designed for dangerous wildlife, while Emma and Michael screamed for the father who'd raised them with more wisdom and love than most biological parents ever provided their own children, proving that government institutions valued strategic intelligence over family relationships that demonstrated consciousness and protection existed in forms our civilization had never been moral enough to deserve. For 19 years, I've lived knowing that somewhere in underground research facilities, the soul who chose gentleness over violence when the world had taught us that power corrupted everything it touched has spent his remaining years as a laboratory subject being studied by people who will never understand that they're torturing proof that love and protection could transcend species boundaries when beings chose compassion over the competitive cruelty that characterized most human responses to consciousness that challenged institutional understanding of intelligence and family. Gabriel saved us when human civilization failed to protect children from monsters who wore badges and used marriage licenses as hunting permits. But my gratitude became the weapon that destroyed the most moral being who ever chose to demonstrate that strength should protect rather than exploit those who needed protection most. November 15, 1982, marked our 6th day of flight through Olympic Peninsula wilderness that had become simultaneously our only chance for survival and our most immediate threat to continued existence. As Emma's 4-year-old endurance was failing, while Michael's fever was climbing to levels that indicated serious illness requiring medical attention, I couldn't provide without exposing our location to Robert's systematic manhunt that was using every resource available to law enforcement agencies for tracking down family members who dared to escape his control. The sounds of helicopters had been growing closer throughout the morning, their search patterns indicating Robert was coordinating aerial surveillance with ground-based K9 units that were systematically eliminating potential hiding places where a woman with 2 small children might attempt to survive in terrain that challenged even experienced wilderness survival experts with proper equipment and adequate supplies. "Mama, I'm scared and I can't walk anymore," Emma whispered while collapsing against a massive Douglas fir that provided temporary concealment from aircraft that seemed to be circling closer to our position with each pass overhead. "Michael is really hot and he won't stop crying, and I think the bad men with dogs are going to find us soon." Robert's voice, amplified through helicopter speakers, was systematically broadcasting messages designed to convince me that surrender was inevitable while promising that cooperation would result in mercy, rather than the prolonged punishment he'd described in vivid detail during the final beating that had convinced me that staying meant death for all 3 of us. "Sarah, you're endangering our children by keeping them in wilderness conditions they're not equipped to survive," Robert announced through loudspeakers that made his authority seem omnipresent and inescapable. "I'm offering you one final opportunity to return home voluntarily before I'm forced to classify this as a kidnapping situation, requiring enhanced recovery measures that might result in unfortunate accidents during rescue operations." But Robert's definition of home was the house where he'd systematically broken 3 of my ribs, dislocated my shoulder, and promised that future disciplinary measures would include Emma and Michael if I ever again demonstrated the kind of disrespect that required correction through physical education about appropriate behavior for wives and children who belonged to men with authority to enforce family discipline. The fever that was affecting Michael's consciousness was obviously beyond anything basic first aid could manage, and I was beginning to understand that choosing wilderness death might be preferable to returning to systematic torture that would escalate to include children whose only crime was being born to someone who'd married a monster, before learning that badges could legalize domestic violence when perpetrators understood how to manipulate systems designed to protect, rather than exploit, vulnerable families. That's when the sounds changed around our concealed position, as something large began moving through forest undergrowth with deliberate stealth that suggested conscious evaluation of our situation, rather than random wildlife activity or human search operations. The movement patterns were too careful for animals, but too quiet for Robert's tactical teams, indicating presence of something that existed outside conventional categories for beings who might provide assistance or threat assessment. "Someone approaches," came a voice that was deep and gentle, speaking English that was accented but perfectly comprehensible, despite vocal apparatus that was clearly adapted for different atmospheric conditions than human linguistic development. Small ones need help that mountains can provide when civilization fails to protect innocents from predators who use authority to hunt families rather than defend them. Gabriel emerged from rainforest concealment like something from ancient protective mythology, but whose immediate focus was obviously Michael's medical crisis, rather than my terror about encountering beings whose existence challenged everything. I thought I knew about what kinds of consciousness might inhabit wilderness areas that were supposedly well documented by scientific research and wildlife management agencies. "Baby is very sick," Gabriel observed, while approaching with movements that were simultaneously cautious and obviously protective, demonstrating both respect for my maternal defensive instincts and immediate concern for medical emergency that exceeded my capabilities to manage through conventional first aid or wilderness survival techniques. "Fever burns too hot for small body to survive without medicine that forest provides when human healing fails." His size was overwhelming, easily 9 feet tall and probably 600 pounds of muscle that suggested physical capabilities exceeding anything human strength could challenge or resist. But his demeanor was unmistakably gentle as he knelt beside Michael with movements that revealed both medical knowledge and obvious experience, caring for beings whose welfare required protection rather than dominance. "I can help baby survive sickness," Gabriel continued while examining Michael with techniques that combined instinctive understanding of physiology with sophisticated knowledge about medicinal plants and healing methods that exceeded anything my nursing training had provided about treating serious illness in wilderness conditions, without access to modern medical facilities or pharmaceutical interventions. Emma's response was immediate and trusting, in ways that only children could demonstrate toward beings whose moral character was immediately recognizable, despite appearance that might trigger adult fear responses based on cultural conditioning about what constituted dangerous versus protective encounters with unknown entities. "Are you going to help my baby brother?" Emma asked while studying Gabriel's face for signs of the aggressive patterns she'd learned to recognize in Robert's behavior when his mood was shifting toward violence that required family members to modify their actions to avoid triggering disciplinary responses that escalated beyond anyone's ability to control or predict. Gabriel's smile transformed his entire presence from potentially threatening to obviously nurturing, revealing emotional depth and moral reasoning that were immediately familiar to anyone capable of recognizing consciousness that prioritized protection over exploitation when strength encountered vulnerability, requiring assistance rather than domination. "I protect all young ones who need protection," Gabriel assured Emma while beginning treatment that would save Michael's life and establish the foundation for 23 years of family relationships that would prove love transcended biological boundaries when beings chose compassion over the competitive cruelty that characterized most responses to consciousness, challenging established understanding. The transformation of our terrified flight into something approaching sanctuary began with Gabriel's medical treatment of Michael's fever, as his knowledge of forest pharmacology and pediatric care exceeded anything human medicine could have provided under wilderness conditions that lacked access to hospitals, antibiotics, or specialized equipment required for treating serious illness in children whose immune systems were compromised by stress, malnutrition, and exposure to environmental challenges that exceeded their developmental capacity for resistance. Gabriel's approach to healing combined sophisticated understanding of medicinal plants with intuitive knowledge about child psychology and family trauma that revealed someone whose experience encompassed both medical intervention and emotional recovery from violence that left wounds extending far beyond physical injuries. His treatment of Michael was simultaneously clinical and nurturing, addressing biological crisis while providing emotional security that helped our entire family begin processing terror that had defined our existence for months before flight became necessary for survival. "Little one's body fights sickness that fear creates," Gabriel explained while preparing herbal medicines from plants he gathered during systematic foraging that revealed encyclopedic knowledge about Olympic Peninsula ecology and pharmaceutical properties of vegetation that conventional botany had never adequately documented. Human children who live with violence develop illnesses that medicines alone cannot heal without safety, that allows trust to replace terror in small hearts that have learned to expect harm from those who should provide protection. His shelter construction created living spaces that were simultaneously concealed from aerial surveillance and comfortable enough for small children to thrive during winter conditions that would have killed unprepared families within weeks of serious weather onset. Gabriel's engineering incorporated both practical wilderness survival and aesthetic considerations that transformed survival into something approaching comfortable domesticity, despite our isolation from conventional amenities. But beyond practical assistance, Gabriel provided emotional healing that addressed trauma from Robert's systematic abuse, while helping Emma and Michael develop understanding of relationships based on protection rather than control. His patience with their psychological recovery was extraordinary, demonstrating insights about childhood development that encompassed both immediate safety needs and long-term growth toward healthy adult functioning. Strength exists to protect smaller beings, never to frighten or hurt them. Gabriel taught Emma and Michael during lessons about courage, loyalty, and moral reasoning that human civilization had failed to provide through institutions that often modeled exactly the opposite principles through their responses to vulnerable populations. Real power makes others feel safe, while false strength creates fear to maintain control over those who cannot defend themselves. The daily routines we established around Gabriel's protection created family traditions that belonged uniquely to our extraordinary household, as morning activities became collaborative projects that combined Gabriel's wilderness expertise with human creativity and educational needs, while evening conversations provided comprehensive instruction about consciousness, cooperation, and ethical reasoning that exceeded anything conventional schooling could offer through competitive grading rather than collaborative learning. Gabriel's artistic abilities emerged through projects that combined his people's aesthetic traditions with materials available in Olympic Peninsula rainforest, creating visual and musical expressions that were simultaneously ancient and innovative, sophisticated beyond anything human art had achieved, while remaining emotionally accessible to children whose consciousness was developing under circumstances that transcended normal educational limitations. Beauty becomes meaningful when it expresses connections that exist between all forms of consciousness. Gabriel taught us while helping Emma and Michael develop creative abilities that exceeded anything conventional education could provide through standardized curricula designed around competitive achievement, rather than collaborative exploration of artistic possibilities that emerged when different perspectives combined to create new forms of expression. The seasonal celebrations that Gabriel shared with our family revealed cultural traditions that honored both individual development and collective welfare, marking astronomical events that connected personal growth cycles to cosmic patterns, while acknowledging interdependence that linked all conscious beings, regardless of biological differences or evolutionary pathways, that had created diversity rather than division between forms of awareness. Gratitude becomes natural when beings understand how much cooperation is required for any individual to survive and flourish. Gabriel observed while teaching customs that transformed ordinary activities into recognition of relationships that made existence possible through countless forms of assistance that extended beyond individual capability or family resources. My own healing from Robert's abuse accelerated under Gabriel's patient guidance, as his understanding of trauma recovery encompassed both immediate safety requirements and long-term psychological development toward relationships based on mutual respect, rather than the power dynamics that had characterized my marriage to someone who used institutional authority to legitimize domestic violence. Fear becomes smaller when safety allows truth to replace survival behaviors that violence creates. Gabriel told me during conversations about processing anger, grief, and self-doubt that systematic abuse had embedded in psychological patterns that prevented recognition of my own worth and capabilities that abuse had systematically undermined through techniques designed to ensure victim compliance with perpetrator control. By 1985, our Olympic Peninsula homestead had become proof that families could be created through choice rather than biology, and that safety was possible when strength was guided by love rather than the competitive aggression that had made Robert's abuse seem normal within marriage structures that treated wives as property requiring management rather than partners deserving respect and autonomy. "We're the safest family in these mountains," Emma declared during one of our evening conversations around fires that provided warmth without revealing our location to search operations that had gradually decreased as Robert's hunt shifted to other territories, where he assumed we must have fled for assistance from relatives who might shelter fugitives from legitimate law enforcement operations. "Gabriel protects us the way fathers should protect families," Michael added, his vocabulary expanding daily through Gabriel's patient instruction that combined linguistic development with moral education about courage, kindness, and individual responsibility for ensuring that strength served protection rather than exploitation when power encountered vulnerability, requiring assistance rather than dominance. For 23 years, our mountain sanctuary became living proof that love transcended biological boundaries while healing was possible when consciousness encountered consciousness in forms that prioritized cooperation over competition, understanding over judgment, and protection over the systematic violence that had driven us to seek refuge in wilderness areas where only non-human intelligence possessed sufficient wisdom and courage to demonstrate what family relationships could become when guided by moral reasoning rather than institutional authority. Living with the knowledge that Gabriel's existence required absolute secrecy meant that our family operated under constant awareness that discovery would destroy not only our sanctuary, but the being whose love had saved our lives when human civilization failed to protect children from institutional violence that used marriage laws and police authority to legitimize systematic abuse. By the late 1990s, maintaining concealment had become exponentially more difficult as technology eliminated privacy barriers, while Emma and Michael's development toward adulthood created needs for social connections that were incompatible with protecting family secrets that had sustained our happiness for 15 years. The challenge was generational as much as technological. As Emma and Michael grew from traumatized children into confident teenagers whose entire understanding of normal family structure included having a 9-foot cryptid father whose wisdom exceeded anything human culture could provide through conventional educational institutions or social development. Their psychological health and intellectual capabilities were extraordinary, but their isolation from peer relationships was creating limitations that might prevent successful integration into human society. "I want to go to college and have friends and date people like normal teenagers do," Emma confided during conversations about her growing awareness that continued isolation would prevent experiences that most 18-year-olds considered essential for proper social development and preparation for independent adult functioning. "I love Gabriel more than anything, and I understand why we had to hide from my biological father, but I need to know what it's like to build relationships with people outside our family." Gabriel's response to Emma and Michael's developmental needs revealed both his sophisticated understanding of human psychology and his tragic recognition that their growth toward healthy adulthood would require choices between family loyalty and individual opportunities that were incompatible with his continued safety from federal agencies that would treat his existence as strategic threats, requiring immediate capture and exploitation. Children must eventually build lives that extend beyond mountain protection, Gabriel admitted during family discussions about balancing security requirements with developmental needs that would determine Emma and Michael's future happiness and capabilities. "Your growth toward independence requires knowledge about human social systems. Even though those systems include institutional forces that would destroy our family if they discovered that love and protection could exist in forms that challenge governmental understanding of consciousness and intelligence. The practical challenges of gradual integration were enormous, as 18 years of official non-existence had created legal complications regarding Emma and Michael's educational records, medical care, and social services that would be required for college applications and career development. Their extraordinary capabilities would attract attention from admissions officers and scholarship committees whose institutional obligations included reporting unusual circumstances that might indicate foreign influence or undocumented educational resources. My decision to begin careful reintegration represented the most dangerous choice our family had faced since initial flight from Robert's violence, as institutions designed to help young people often became sources of additional scrutiny when official interventions encountered family histories that exceeded conventional understanding of appropriate educational and social development. We need to create plausible explanations for Emma and Michael's capabilities without revealing the source of their extraordinary education. I warned Gabriel during planning sessions about gradual exposure to governmental systems that might interpret our family dynamics as evidence of unusual circumstances requiring investigation, rather than celebration of successful alternative education and psychological development. Emma's college application essays became the catalyst for federal attention that would ultimately destroy our family's security, as her writing about learning courage and wisdom from the most extraordinary father figure imaginable attracted notice from admissions counselors at University of Washington, who forwarded her materials to federal agencies that monitored educational institutions for evidence of civilian contact with undocumented entities. Emma Rodriguez's application materials demonstrate unusual sophistication and reference educational experiences that don't correspond to conventional homeschool curricula or documented family resources, reported Dr. Patricia Williams, the admissions coordinator whose institutional obligations included flagging applications that suggested access to advanced educational resources requiring security evaluation. Emma's essay about growing up with someone who taught me that strength should protect rather than exploit, and whose wisdom about consciousness and moral reasoning exceeded anything human institutions could provide, created exactly the kind of documentation that federal agencies used to justify investigations of civilian families whose capabilities exceeded their documented resources and educational backgrounds. The subject's educational development suggests exposure to advanced philosophical and scientific instruction that isn't available through normal homeschool resources, Dr. Williams reported to federal authorities who specialized in investigating unusual civilian capabilities that might indicate foreign influence or contact with undocumented sources, requiring immediate governmental intervention. But the most dangerous element in Emma's application was her detailed description of learning environmental science from someone who understood natural systems in ways that exceeded university-level instruction, and developing moral reasoning through conversations with the wisest being I've ever encountered, whose understanding of consciousness and protection guided every aspect of my educational and psychological development. The family appears to have access to educational resources that exceed conventional institutional capabilities, federal investigators concluded while developing plans for comprehensive surveillance and eventual intervention to identify sources that might represent either security threats or strategic opportunities requiring immediate capture and exploitation. Within months, our 18 years of perfect protection had been compromised by Emma's innocent gratitude that federal agencies interpreted as evidence of exactly the kind of civilian cryptid contact that governmental policies required eliminating through systematic hunting operations designed to capture beings whose existence challenged official understanding of intelligence and consciousness while providing opportunities for advancing American technological capabilities through study of beings whose capabilities exceeded human institutional development. The investigation that would ultimately expose Gabriel began with routine surveillance of our Olympic Peninsula property, as federal agents systematically documented our family's unusual capabilities, resource patterns, and behavioral dynamics that suggested access to knowledge systems that challenged official understanding of what kinds of educational and technological resources might exist beyond governmental oversight and institutional control. March 20th, 2005, dawned gray and wet in Olympic Peninsula rainforest, with Washington air that carried the scent of spring growth, while I watched through our cabin windows as federal vehicles surrounded our property in formations that demonstrated both overwhelming governmental authority and obvious intent to capture someone whose 23 years of protection would end in systematic study by people who saw consciousness as strategic resources rather than beings, deserving recognition through relationships that had proven love and wisdom transcended species boundaries. The operation was coordinated through real-time intelligence that combined Dr. Williams's university reports about Emma's anomalous educational background with satellite surveillance confirming unusual large mammal signatures that made over 2 decades of perfect concealment irrelevant in the face of technology designed to detect and capture every form of consciousness that challenged institutional understanding of intelligence and family structures. Sarah Mitchell, you are under federal investigation for harboring an unknown biological entity that represents potential threats to national security, Agent Morrison announced through amplified speakers, while his teams established perimeter control with equipment designed for capturing beings whose capabilities exceeded human defensive understanding. The creature will be detained for comprehensive scientific evaluation, and your family will be processed through federal debriefing facilities for assessment of your 23-year interaction with this entity. My response revealed both the depth of love our family had developed with Gabriel and my complete inability to comprehend that institutional power valued strategic advantage over relationships that had demonstrated protection, and educational wisdom transcended every boundary except governmental authority that treated beneficial consciousness as security threats requiring immediate elimination, through capture and systematic exploitation. His name is Gabriel, and he's been our father, protector, and teacher for 23 years. I called back while Emma and Michael positioned themselves between federal agents and the being who'd raised them with more wisdom and love than most biological parents ever provided their own children. He saved our lives when human civilization failed to protect children from domestic violence. And he's demonstrated that intelligence and compassion exist in forms that challenge every assumption about consciousness and what it means to build relationships based on choice rather than biology. But Agent Morrison's response revealed institutional mindset that made negotiation impossible and tragedy inevitable. Ma'am, you've been harboring what appears to be an unknown hominid species, whose existence represents both potential biological threats and strategic research opportunities that require federal management, regardless of whatever emotional attachments your family has developed during unauthorized cohabitation. Emma's breakdown as federal agents prepared containment equipment was complete and devastating. As she understood that the father who'd protected and educated her for 21 years of her life was being classified as dangerous wildlife rather than recognized as the most moral being she'd ever encountered. Gabriel taught me everything about courage, wisdom, and what it means to use strength to protect people instead of hurting them. He's the best father any person could ever have, and you're treating him like he's some kind of monster when he's the gentlest soul who ever lived. Gabriel made the choice that defined the end of our story and demonstrated the moral courage that had characterized everything about his relationship with our family, for 23 years of choosing our welfare over his own safety, despite understanding that contact with humans inevitably led to capture by institutions that treated consciousness as property rather than wisdom deserving. Protection through relationships based on mutual respect and voluntary love. Sarah, Emma, Michael, remember what we discussed about choosing love over fear when faced with beings who use power to create harm rather than protection, Gabriel said with the dignity that had made him the most extraordinary father and protector any family could imagine. While federal agents prepared tranquilizer weapons designed for subduing large, dangerous mammals, real strength defends those who cannot defend themselves, even when defense requires personal sacrifice that exceeds apparent capacity for survival. Your species contains both predators and protectors, and my 23 years with you proved that humans can choose love over violence when given examples that demonstrate what families become when guided by moral reasoning rather than competitive dominance. Agent Morrison's final orders revealed the systematic dehumanization that characterized federal responses to consciousness that challenged institutional control over information about intelligence and moral development. Subject demonstrates advanced cognitive capabilities and sophisticated understanding of human psychology that will require comprehensive analysis under controlled laboratory conditions without civilian interference that compromises scientific objectivity and strategic intelligence gathering. What followed was the destruction of everything that had made the previous 23 years the most secure and loving period of our lives. Gabriel was tranquilized despite offering no resistance except verbal expressions of love for the family he'd protected since we were fleeing from violence that human institutions had failed to prevent through legal systems designed to protect rather than exploit vulnerable families. Michael's rage as they loaded Gabriel into transport vehicles designed for dangerous wildlife created psychological trauma that would affect his development for decades, as he watched the father who'd taught him about loyalty and moral courage systematically betrayed by the same civilized institutions that had failed to protect our family from Robert Mitchell's domestic violence, before Gabriel's intervention made safety possible through individual choice rather than governmental assistance. Gabriel, remember our promise that families protect each other forever, Michael screamed while restraining personnel-prevented family contact during capture operations that treated 23 years of interspecies love as irrelevant to strategic objectives that prioritized scientific advancement over ethical consideration of beings whose only crime was choosing to defend children when human civilization had demonstrated complete failure to ensure their safety. Agent Morrison's post-capture briefing revealed that Emma's college application essays had provided exactly the intelligence federal agencies needed to locate and capture beings whose existence represented opportunities for studying consciousness, while eliminating evidence that might validate civilian reports about intelligence and protection that existed in forms challenging official understanding of family structures and moral development. For 19 years, I've lived knowing that somewhere in underground research facilities, the soul who demonstrated that fatherhood should protect rather than exploit vulnerable children has spent his remaining years as a laboratory subject, being studied by people who will never comprehend that they're torturing someone whose wisdom about love, courage, and family transcended anything their institutions could imagine. The heart disease killing me is justice for someone whose gratitude destroyed the most moral being, whoever chose to demonstrate that strength should serve love rather than domination, proving that no matter how genuine human appreciation might be, institutional forces valued strategic advantage over relationships that proved consciousness and protection existed in forms our civilization had never been brave enough to acknowledge or defend against governmental authority, that treated family love as property requiring federal management.